I have introduced Dr. Johnson previously, so today I'll just remind you that he is on the faculty at Hope College. He teaches Old Testament Hebrew Bible courses for them, among other things. Before coming to Hope, he was on the faculty at King's College in New York City. And we are delighted to have you back again. He flew in last night so that he could be a part of the class today. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Johnson back.
Thank you, sir. Good. I can't believe you guys keep coming back for more, so that's incredible. Okay, so today we're going to finish up this discussion mainly from the biblical side, because again, the Darwin side, I think we're mostly familiar with how that works. And we're really talking about a conceptual analysis of how Darwin and later and current evolutionary science conceptualize the world around them, and how the biblical authors conceptualize the world around them, where there's overlap and where there's disjunct. So we'll see some areas of overlap and disjunct today. I will also say, now this may not be true of this group. When I was a pastor as well, I did Tuesday and Thursday early morning prayer, which meant I had to get up at 5 to go in and lead the early morning prayer, and which meant it was me and a bunch of 60, 70, and 80-year-olds. And they had been up for hours at that point. Like the women all had their makeup done, and I was rolling out of bed with 4 small children. Okay, so what I have found is that when I present to you what I would consider to be non-controversial conceptual issues according to biblical scholars, whether they're religious biblical scholars or whether they're non-religious biblical scholars, that some people of the Christian tradition have some trouble with this, right? So what I am going to present is, and I'll tell you where what I'm presenting might be considered controversial, and I'll tell you where I don't think it is actually that controversial, although it may feel very controversial to you, right? And I mean by that, I'm going to present the minimal view that is open, obvious, and repeated in Scripture. So when I say, so some things that bother people, when you say, well, where did Satan come from? We talked about this, I think, last time. People are like, oh, he was one of God's angels who was beautiful, the father of lies, ended up rebelling against God and being cast down with a third of the angels down with him. I say, great, that's just not in Scripture. So I don't, as a biblical scholar, I'm like, that's not part of the Old or New Testament. So we don't include it in the discourse on what the Old or New Testament authors thought. Could something like that be reconciled with the Old or New Testament? Possibly, right? If you squint to the left and cock your head right at night a mile away, you can make something like that work. And you can see why people would want to try to explain, where do these demons come from? Where do these adversaries come from? There's a story begging to be told there. So that's an example of something that for biblical scholars is not controversial to say, hey, that's not in the Bible, so I'm just not going to present that as if that's the biblical author's view. But for a lot of people, they say, what do you mean that's not in the Bible? Right. So that's what I mean. Okay, so this is the final part. And, I thought I'd just start with the big matzo ball, which is, what's the goal of these two different conceptual worlds? Like, what are they trying to explain? What do they think reality is like? So I'll just go over these very quickly. One, and I just put Darwin at the top. Because my scientist friends said they hate the word Darwinism because Christians just throw everything in this big bucket called Darwinism, and they don't always know what they mean by it. So I'm going to say Darwin himself, which will include a lot of current evolutionary science, but not all of it, right? So what's the goal? Goal is continuous adaptation, right? To say that, look, doesn't matter if the Earth keeps on warming up into the point where all of our oceans are boiling and there's no more humans. What he's trying to describe will still account for that when humans are gone for millions of years. Because it's nature continues the way it's supposed to. And this is a big one. Nature continues and physical laws persist. The way the world is now is the way it has always been, right? So first, second, third laws of thermodynamics have never changed. All energy in the universe today is the same energy that it had at the beginning. Now, the Big Bang, everybody's like, we don't like to talk about that because it's a little mysterious, but the energy was there. Everything works the exact same way it always has. Human history will come to a close, right? I gave a talk at Earth X once where this is a big environment like Earth Day Expo believe it or not, in Dallas, Texas. It's funded by a billionaire who got his money from oil, from his daddy's oil wells. But so he runs this huge environmentalist expo. Great. It's very interesting. You get to see all the latest things that are going on with environmentalism. And the guy invited me to come give a talk. He's an atheist, but one of his people said, hey, you should have somebody talk from like the Christian perspective. And I said, well, I don't know about the Christian, but I'll talk about it from the biblical perspective. And my talk was, I understand why Christians should be motivated to environmental practices. I just can't understand why an atheist would, right? And the idea is, Christians, hopefully we would see from the biblical literature that we're not just thrown into some world we can use and abuse, but actually have a very, as we've discussed, our relationship to the environment is very closely connected. Even in the biblical language used to describe humans and their relationship to the environment, it's all connectional language. That we are part of the dirt. To the dirt we will return as a part of the curse, right? So part of that too, and the Darwin side is, well, essentially, if you look at the long story, is the sun is either going to cool down to where everything in our planetary system freezes, or it's going to blow up and burn us all to smithereens, right? This world will not continue the way this way forever. Millions of years from now, who knows what. So then the question becomes, well, why do anything environmental? Like, why try to preserve anything? Why try to make the world somewhat better when it's all going to just burn up anyways, right? Is that the Neil Young song, better to burn out than to fade away, or something like that? So, but that's the story. We are in the Anthropocene era. This is the new term that's kind of floated up to the surface. So we dominate right now, but we won't dominate forever, and we won't matter in the end, because there'll be nobody here, no bacteria that survive will care about us, right? Or any of the artifacts that we leave behind. Generation will cease, right? Which we'll talk about in a little bit here. Scarcity will continue. So this Darwinistic adaptation, whatever that looks like, whether that's cooperative or violent and competitive, that's going to continue even when it's just bacteria or whatever supersedes bacteria, proto-eukaryotes or something, whatever ends up being the thing that survives biologically. Scarcity is going to continue. Death will become complete at some point when the earth and the universe blows up, or like the earth blows up under the power of the sun. And it goes without saying, nobody goes to heaven, right? In Darwin's picture. Okay, so we come over to the biblical authors, and again, I just kind of paired these so easier for comparison, but obviously there would be some other things we could throw in here. One is, what's the goal? The new heavens, new earth, the renewed heavens and the renewed earth, which we'll look at in a second here. So the world is different. It was one way, and now it's another way. Now, if you think about that from the physical sciences, right? If you're taking the biblical author's perspective of reality really, really seriously, you have to say, Darwin very rightly studied the world the way he finds it. I think if we pulled at least the prophets and Moses and certainly Jesus and John of Revelation, if we pulled them into the room and said, hey, was the world in a physically different set of affairs? And then we'd have to explain what we mean by physical, by nature, and all these things. But once we explain all of those things, they say, no. Nature was different back then. Nature worked beneficently. It caused things to flourish. Things were integrated, right? It was a coherent whole. And what you're seeing is actually a denatured world, if you want to put it that way. Or again, cancer cells, right? They're just human body cells that turn against the body. Well, there used to be a way in which human body cells did not turn against the body and convince other cells to do the same. That the world was the same physical world, but in a different orientation. So that's a slightly controversial claim. Some biblical authors see that as obvious in the text. Some biblical scholars see that as obvious in the biblical text. Some say, maybe not. I think it's there. And one reason they don't, and one reason I think it's there is because I think Deuteronomy and Genesis both describe it, right? The dirt, which could have been for your flourishing, gets cursed and turns against you. In Deuteronomy 28, it says the same thing. If you listen to my voice and become my people, then everything you touch, the dirt will be blessed because of you. And then it says, but if you don't, then it'll be cursed because of you. Well, most biblical scholars don't think Deuteronomy and Genesis have anything to do with each other. They're written by different people in different centuries with different agendas, and they're all just trying to control the masses through their religious text. So that's one reason why some biblical authors would not believe this thing that I'm saying about good creation that just gets turned against itself, but it's the same creation. But if you take Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus to be written by kind of this people who think very similarly about the world, then you do see this connection that the world is disoriented right now, but it used to be rightly oriented, and it will eventually be rightly oriented again. It's what Jesus talks about as the age of the resurrection, or the new heavens, new earth. Sometimes it's just called that day by the prophets, the day of Yahweh. I have a graph of the timeline coming up here. Okay, so the goal is new heavens, new earth. What happens in new heavens, new earth? History continues. Like, we still write stories about each other. We still laugh at each other. We still, like, things keep on going. Generation continues, which this will be the last thing we'll talk about. This will be controversial. And it's because I and some people have seen this. Some people don't like it. But I will argue that sex and baby making will still happen in the new heavens and new earth. And I'll show you exactly why I believe that. I'm not just saying it, right? I'm not just saying that because I want to have sex with my wife in the new heavens and new earth. That will be great, but that's not the only reason I'm saying it. Scarcity is replaced by sufficiency. And we'll look at Revelation 21 in just one second. And it's actually a friend of mine at Grand Rapids Calvin Theological Seminary. She's a systematic theologian. We were working in a work group together when I was writing this book on Darwin. And I kept on saying no longer scarcity, but what was I calling it? Abundance. And she goes, where are you getting this abundance from? That's nowhere in Scripture. It doesn't say abundance is not the opposite of scarcity. Sufficiency is the opposite. You will get enough rains. The food will come in enough that you will have it, right? This idea that there's an overwhelming abundance actually is difficult to find in Scripture. Okay, and then death is replaced by life in the land, right? So death does not become complete, for some, I should say. And still, one of the areas of compatibility between Darwin's thinking and the biblical author's thinking, no one goes to heaven. I should amend that. 2 people in the Bible go to heaven. Anybody, did we talk about the 2 people that go to heaven? Enoch is a middling case, right? So he was there and then he was not. So what happened to him, we don't know. I mean, they wrote a whole book about him in Hellenistic Judaism, trying to explain what happened to them, but I don't know what their sources were. But there was another one I heard. Elijah went to heaven, unambiguously went up into the heavens. I should say the heavens, because there's no singular for heaven in the Bible. And then the other big one in the whole Bible, New Testament, I'll give you a cheat. Jesus. So 2 men go to heaven in the Bible, and that's it in the entire Bible. Which is weird if you think about what you hear about, if you ask people, what do Christians think about what happens to you after you die? You almost always hear you go to heaven, right? So you would think if you opened up all their literature that talks about this, the Bible, you think it would say that somewhere, that when you die, you go to heaven. It's strangely absent from the whole Bible, right? Except for these 2 people, Elijah and then Jesus. And Jesus, as you probably imagine, has some very interesting connections to Elijah. So notice that the goal is not to go to heaven, right? Because then that creates a whole other set of problems, right? What goes to heaven? Does my whole body go to heaven? Or does just my soul? Well, if my soul goes to heaven, then now I have this whole other problem. Where is my soul in my body? Does my soul have to disconnect from my body? Does the body go into the ground, the soul goes in the heavens, and then what happens in the day of resurrection? Does my soul have to come from heaven down into the ground and then come back up with my body? You have to start adding all these stories. Remember that story I told you about how did the man know that the woman was his fit mate, his strong ally? And one rabbi said, oh, I know. He had sex with all the animals, and then he had sex with a woman, and that's how I could tell. You have to start making up stories like that to figure out what happens with the soul and the body, right? Fortunately for us, you don't have to make up any of those stories. We can just stick to what the biblical authors say, and we'll get there next slide. Revelation 21, I want to come back to this one because scarcity features so largely in this story about evolution, which I would say, I think it's correct. I think Darwin accurately mapped the world. I mean, you can argue about whether competition is the primary way, violent competition is the primary way that natural selection happens, or whether it's a cooperative attempt between creatures and friendliness and all those kinds of things. But I think when Darwin looked around the world, I think he basically said, yeah, this is how the world seems to work. And I think any biblical author would go, yep, you are right. This is how the world works now. But it didn't used to work that way. And it's not always going to work that way. I think that's the biggest conceptual difference. If we're talking about the biggest difference in their conceptual worlds. Revelation 21, again, another touch point on scarcity here. And I'll just read it to you. I'm sure you all know this probably pretty well. But Revelation 21, this is the new heaven and new earth. This is the very end of Revelation, you probably know. And I'll just read two sections here from Revelation 21 and then chapter 22 as well. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, or a renewed heaven, new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven, or out from heaven, from God, prepared as a bride adorned to her husband. So the interesting image here is a bride coming to her husband, which works in the ancient world as it does today. So the heavens are coming down to the earth. Why don't you need to go to heaven? Because that's not where we're going. The heavens are coming back down to earth. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. So notice what's going on here. Heavens, heavenly creatures, not angels, but heavenly creatures like seraphim, cherubim, God being up in the heavens is not the way it's supposed to be. His proper dwelling place is Emmanuel, God with us. So he's coming back down to his people, and they will be his people, and he will dwell with them, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. And I think they're referring here to things are changed. Something about the physical world has changed. And he who was seated on the throne said, behold, I am making things new. So again, it's not I am made a new world. It's I'm making the things that are already there new. I'm renewing, as they might say. And then just like Isaiah, you have to talk about the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, the murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters. They're going to go down into a lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death, which is what I call the problem of all the violence in the New Testament, right? I'm an Old Testament scholar, and people will say, I just don't like all the violence in the Old Testament. I'm like, excuse me? Tell me how you feel about all the violence in the New Testament, because that's where the most violent thing to happen in human history is recorded. It just hasn't happened yet. But they talk about it a lot. In fact, Jesus talks about it almost more than any other topic, how he's going to come back and kill a bunch of people. Now, how you think that shakes out, whatever, but he talks about it as a pretty violent act. Okay, chapter 22. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as a crystal, flowing from the throne of God and the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. Also on either side of the river, the tree of life, with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be anything accursed. So the dirt won't be cursed anymore. So we're still talking about the cursing of the dirt at the very end. But the throne of God and the Lamb of God will be in it, and his slaves will worship him, and they will see his face, and and his name will be on their foreheads, and night will be no more. There will be no need for lamp of light or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever. Okay, I take it you've heard this language before, right? The heavens come down, they renew the earth, and then you have the wicked that are sent away. Okay, you ready for the big Bible timeline that I made for myself, because I couldn't find anybody who had made something that was worthwhile here? This is what I call the simplified storyline of the heavens and the earth. If you want a nice cartoon that does this really well, there's a thing called the Bible Project. These two friends of mine in Portland, that one's a biblical scholar and one's an artist, and they create really good explanations of biblical theologies, concepts across scripture. And I think their very first video they put out was Heaven and Earth, and it's spot on. Okay. So notice heavenly realm is up there, earthly realm is down here. Now, when I talk about theology, I mean, I think the implications of the text are this. That's what theology means. I think this is what the text means when we're speaking theology, versus what the text just says, right? So it's a theological point on my part, to say, I think the heavens and the earth were jammed together in Eden. There are indications. You have a heavenly creature there. It's not an angel, it's a cherubim, something that is only seen in the heavenly realm, who guards the way back to Eden. You see God who walks around in the windy part of the day in Eden, who talks to the couple directly. After Eden, after they leave Eden, God never talks to anybody directly, ever. And so it feels very, it's always by a messenger, or it's always by proxy, it's by visions, dreams. There's always something in between God and the person he's communicating with. But in Eden, it seems to be all direct. So these are all indicators, theological indicators, that Eden is being described, conceptualized, as a jamming together of the heavens and the earth, which means after Eden, now we're getting, this is the natural part of the cosmos. After Eden, it gets denatured, unnaturalized. So that God now stays in the heavenly realm. He talks with humans. He can hear humans. He talks with them through his messengers, the angels, the angelos. And that's what a malachim is, the Hebrew for angel, right? So you have the malachim, Yahweh, that they talk on his behalf. God can hear the petitions of humanity. I put the Holy Spirit in here because I didn't know what else to call it, but you have this kind of like ambiguous spirit of God and spirits from God being sent back and forth between the heavens and the earthly realm. And it's not until Jesus that we have a kind of radical change in this nature of the relationship, where something from heaven comes down and becomes a physical earthly being, as far as we can tell. Okay, here's the key to all of this up, down, forget about that for a second. What's really important is that in the Hebrew Bible, when you die, you go precisely to one place. They do talk about where you go. It's called Sheol. It's basically a synonym for the grave. It's a place where the dead go. There's no judgment. In fact, there's not much of anything going on down there. It's just into the earth. The few little glimpses we get about what's going on in Sheol are mostly in poetry. So David will say in the Psalms, you know, nobody remembers your name in Sheol. Nobody can praise you from Sheol, oh God, right? Like it's just this place where people are, and they're in almost like a storage locker, right? Nothing's going on down there. When you read across the Hebrew Bible, that is exactly what happens to everybody. They go down to Sheol. When you get into the New Testament, it's the exact same thing. For instance, who is a famous person in the New Testament who went down into Sheol? Probably the most famous person. Jesus, right? So, you know, because people always ask, I mean, if you're thinking it, then you're 100% on target. If you say like, wait, didn't he say to the thief on the cross, today you will be with me in paradise, right? And I have to do that biblical scholar thing where I go, he did say those words. He did not mean those words, right? He couldn't have meant those words. Not at least literalistically, he could not have meant those words. Someone want to explain to the rest of us why he could not have meant literalistically, today you will be with me in paradise? Yeah, because he went to Hades. Sheol is in the New Testament, the Greek for it is Hades, right? Which again is a great indication that when they're translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek, they're having to think, okay, what's a Greek? We don't really have a word in Greek for Sheol, but what's the closest thing to Sheol in Greek? Hades, a place where the dead go. There's no judgment, right? It's just kind of a holding tank for the dead. So yeah, Jesus talks about, before he ever dies, he talks about constantly how he must be handed over to the authorities. He must suffer many things. He must die. He must go down into Hades or Sheol for 3 days, counted Jewish days, not 3 24-hour days, but basically two and a half days. And then he will rise again. So when he says this a lot. If you have a red letter Bible, just start reading the red letters and you'll find out he talks about this a lot, maybe across the Gospels, 7, 8, 9, 10 times he talks about this. So it was no mystery before he died that he was absolutely going into Sheol for 3 days. So when he looks over at that dude and says, today you will be with me in paradise, he did not mean today in any kind of sense that we mean today. He did, however, mean 3 days in the same way that we mean, or at least the ancient Hellenistic Jews meant 3 days. Maybe not the way we mean it today, as 3 consecutive 24-hour periods. Now, what did he mean? I mean, so Jesus does this a lot. He says things that he doesn't actually mean them literally, right? This is kind of his constant form of communication. He's always kind of coding things, doing a wink, wink, nod, nod. You know what I mean? And he actually expects you to know what he means. And he gets very frustrated when you don't know what he means and you think he means one thing when he actually means the other thing. So we're going to have to play that game with him. But note, he needs to go down in Hades so that the plan of God can be completed, so that he can be raised up from the dead. Why? Because his resurrection, as Paul says, is the model of our resurrection. Like, it's the same way you saw him go down to the grave is the same way you will rise as well. Your only comfort in death is not that you go to heaven when you die. I'm talking from the New Testament perspective. Your only comfort in death is that you will be raised like Jesus was on that day, the day of resurrection. So it's important that he goes down into the grave. I should also point out Lazarus, his friend, which we'll talk about in a second. Lazarus is not resurrected. Or I should say, it's unclear if I don't think he's resurrected. The text doesn't seem to indicate. Because if he was resurrected, that means he's still running around on earth somewhere today. Because when you're resurrected, you do not die again. The resurrection is final, right? Death is not complete, resurrection. So New Testament scholars like to say Lazarus is resuscitated, not resurrected. We presume that he lived a full life and went on to die later in his life. Although I thought that would be a great plot for a novel, is that Lazarus just keeps on living and like he can speak 200 languages and he hangs out in a bar and just messes with people on trivia night. He just can beat everybody, right? Don't steal that idea from me. I'm still mulling it over in my mind. Okay, so this is resurrection. And again, I'm speaking from like, what's the minimal thing that you must affirm that the New Testament authors are absolutely talking about over and over and over again? Now, you can add things onto this, that your soul and your body separate upon death, your body goes into the grave, and your soul goes into heaven. You can add those things on, but just be aware that you're adding those things onto the minimalistic story here, or that Christian tradition has added those things on. Okay. It's also important for the timeline for Jesus that everybody who dies goes into the grave, because they are all going to be raised and judged. I can send this slide to you if you want the references, but you can go look at all the references. Everybody's going to be raised from the dead, as Jesus says in John 5. The wicked and the righteous will be raised, and they will be judged at that time, right? And now, once you appropriate the view that they seem to have in their head, now you can finally make sense of all the weird things they say in the New Testament that didn't make sense before. Like why this is called the second death. Because you died, you went into the grave, you're resurrected on the day of resurrection with everybody else, you're judged, and you go into the second death, which is also called Gehenna, which is just Aramaic for the valley of Hinnom, which is in Jerusalem today. You can walk through the valley. It's got a beautiful park. There's a little, like a amphitheater for rock concerts they do there in the valley of Hinnom. The Palestinians run their sheep through the valley of Hinnom, right? But Gehenna becomes kind of the metaphor for this place of second death after the judgment. So I think it's very difficult to assert that somebody dies and goes to hell right now, because according to the biblical timeline, what we call hell, which there's not really any word in the biblical language for what we call hell, it doesn't exist yet. That it's actually a place that's going to be created for the day of judgment. And again, if you just tonight, if you're like, this sounds really suspect to me, read the whole New Testament. Just read the gospel, any one of the gospels with this in mind, and you'll be like, oh my goodness, this is a lot cleaner than all that other junk I was trying to pack into the New Testament, stuff that didn't make sense to me. Where does everybody else go? They enter the new heavens and the new earth, right? Remember that book series Left Behind? Yeah, we're all like, yes, do we, right? One of the most, the saddest things in the world is Wayne Grudem's systematic theology is probably the most read systematic theology in the world. And Left Behind is probably the most read eschatology in the world, right? Certain things you can't control. But Left Behind it was a uniquely American theological project, right? So most people are not rapturist, premillennial dispensationalist, right? But what it was suggesting is at the day of resurrection that the people who are left behind on earth was the wicked, and the righteous go up into heaven, right? Which is basically you have to read those two passages in Matthew and Luke exactly the opposite of what they say in order to come to that conclusion. But Tim LaHaye and Philip Jenkins were not opposed to reading those passages exactly the opposite of what they say, right? Okay. We're going to look at those passages because it actually has to do with sex in heaven, right? Whether you get to have sex. And when I say heavens, I'm just referring to the new heavens, new earth, where what we just read, the heavens come down, they renew the earth. We're not back in Eden, but we're back in a kind of Edenized world, right? Things that were the way they were supposed to be are now that way. Everything's rightly oriented again. The phrase, it's called the patria. I forget the second word in the patria. As it was in the beginning, is now, and forevermore shall be, right? When it comes to the biblical author's perspective on what the universe is like over time, they actually don't take that view. They take as it was, is not currently, but one day will be, right? So they have a was and will be, and everything in the middle is messed up. Does that make sense? That basic timeline? It's simple. It seems to be resident, this kind of concept of what happens to you when you die, what you're awaiting. It seems to be resident in all the biblical authors, the prophets. They all have something like this going on. And again, different Christian traditions. Now, if you take the Catholic tradition, for instance, they're going to take that timeline and add quite a few more elements into it, right? Because not only do you have heavens, but you have limbo, you have purgatory. I will say, conceptually speaking, though, purgatory is actually probably closer to Sheol, but Sheol has the whole body and everything that is you goes into Sheol. Purgatory separates out the body from the soul and puts it in kind of this other state, right? Okay. Yes, sir. Good. Absolutely. We will post it so everybody online and everybody can see this and inspect it closer, find all the flaws in it and all that kind of thing. Again, for biblical scholars, this is not so controversial. Because I think, especially for New Testament scholars, especially for confessional New Testament scholars who are in the church, all they do is read the history of the New Testament period and the New Testament text. This is like all they do for, they have very sad lives. It's all they do for a living, right? And then they go into church and they hear the kinds of things people say and they go, yeah, should I mention that is not in the text? Like that. And it's a tough call. I mean, my students, when I usually will, you guys are more mature, but with, younger students, I can't do this in the first 6 weeks of class. I got to build some trust with, let them know that I actually care about what the text says. And then they'll say like, well, what do you say at a funeral? And I say, I actually do. I'm a minister. I've done many funerals, including my own relatives. I say, where is grandma? She is like us, awaiting her resurrection and hopefully entering the new heavens, new earth, right? So there's not anything radically different. And many of you might even recognize if you go around we have graveyards. I was just in the UK yesterday. But the UK is great because you got really old headstones, right? Every cemetery has really, hundreds and hundreds of years old headstones. But even in the United States, if you look at headstones, like even I live over by one of those old Dutch cemeteries down at 32nd. Well, you don't see it in the Dutch ones now that I think about it, but someone can explain to me the Dutch problem. You'll see older headstones say, rest in peace. Right, there's this kind of this acquiescence that resting, or the metaphor in the New Testament, what's the metaphor for somebody who's dead in the New Testament? Sleeping. Yeah. What was the other one I heard? No. Okay. Sleeping. It has this kind of Sheol feel to it, right? The concept of Sheol is embedded in that. And then somewhere around the turn of the 20th century, early 1900s and beyond, you start getting this, and honestly, it shows up mostly on children's graves with our Lord and Savior, right? And children start being depicted. Oh, I hate this. as angels who are with God in heaven, right? You can understand why somebody would want to do that. Certainly, I can understand why somebody would want to do that. It's just we've stepped away from the conceptuality there. Okay. Perfect. Yes, ma'am. Sorry, 1 second. So the people at home can hear you.
That your soul and body are in Sheol?
This would be my contention. If those are two things that are together, it's debatable amongst biblical scholars whether the biblical authors actually think there are two things, one called the soul, one called the body. Even in the New Testament, you do get that language, but it's unclear whether they think these are two different things or whether they're talking about two aspects of the same thing that are interminably fused together. Even in death, they go together kind of idea. Yeah.
Okay, so our body is our soul.
Yeah, there's a lively debate as to which of those is going on in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, I think it's pretty clear. They think you're one thing that has these aspects. Even the word soul, nephesh, is actually comes from the word throat and breath. All these words for life, chaim, chaya, neshma, these all come from breathing, these ideas of living and breathing, being animated, that kind of a thing. So, yes, sir.
I don't see anything there for caught up to meet the Lord in the air, and I don't see anything for the millennial reign. How does that fit your thinking?
So I'm completely agnostic. Thank you for the question on millennial reign. I'm a Presbyterian minister, so we can have lots of different views on whether there's an actual 1,000-year reign or something else. So it would be somewhere, it would be right between here, right? If you want to put the actual 1,000-year reign, if you wanted to follow up on that. Okay, you go ahead and then we'll.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, because you mentioned Revelation 21. Where does the phrase "the sea was no more" factor into this cosmology of a renewed heaven and earth?
The passed awayness, and you get this in Peter's letters as well, the burning up of the heavens and the earth. I think the burning up of the heavens and the earth is a little bit easier because it suggests purification by fire, which would be another metaphor for the renewal of something, right? Is that you're burning out all the bad stuff, right? And that
but the sea
was no more.
I mean, do you think that's just evaporation?
No. So people think different things on this, obviously. Everything I say, people have different thoughts on in the scholarly world. A lot of people think, if you think about the sea for an average Hellenistic Jew, which would include almost everybody in that world in that period, the sea is the place of monsters, chaos, terror. Yeah. So this kind of, since it flows into a passage on no more pain, no more fear, no more death. Hey, even the thing that terrifies you most is gone, right? Yeah.
You'll need to indulge me for just a second.
Yeah. Go ahead.
On a metaphor of a horse in a barn, some mice arguing whether there's a tail on a horse or not. And so the one at the end of the horse, the mouse is insisting there's a tail and two legs.
Oh, yeah.
Arguing vigorously with one on the other side, there's a head and the two legs are not a tail. And the one on the side saying, oh, you're both kind of right. There's a head and a tail and two legs. And the mouse up in the barn looks down and goes, you're all idiots. There's no legs on a horse. Right. And then one comes in from outside, sees the rear side, head and tail, quartering, oh, 4 legs and a tail, et cetera, et cetera. My point,
the 6 blind men of Hindustan with an elephant is the one I've heard.
Like that. But my point being this, that if people want to look at another construct that does address without the agnostic perspective on what's about the rapture, what about the new reign? I don't know. I don't know nothing about that. If you want to look at another perspective on that, there's a book by David Reagan called How to Die with a Smile on Your Face. And that's a humorous way of saying, anticipating what's to come for us.
Right.
And he does the humor with a dead guy on a gurney with the smiley face tag saying, if you understand this way, and he for years was raised in the Reformed tradition that is largely this model. And he came to his minister one time and said, what about this? The guy goes, that's just metaphor. And it's not real.
Yeah.
And he went, wait a minute. I'm not so sure about that. So if you're looking for a simple construct and an easy read 50,000-foot view, it's How to Die with a Smile on Your Face. And it will add another graphic and description that's highly instructive.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, especially for the, I have to admit, because I became a Christian in the charismatic church, I'm mildly allergic to all of those discussions about millennialism. And I always say I'm a pan millennial. It'll all pan out in the end. But yeah, so there does have to be some kind of description about how this does fit with the whatever's going on in Revelation, whether Revelation is a book that tells the same timeline 7 times over in 7 different ways, or whether it's telling one continuous timeline, which again is a big debate amongst Revelation scholars. That will determine where you think those descriptions of events fit within this timeline. But it's always going to be somewhere around here that something has to fit in there.
Done just like gas classes.
Yeah. Nice. Yes, sir.
How does this model inform or help us understand 2 Corinthians 5:8? To be absent from the body, present with.
Just
the
waiting for that one to come up. I would say if you read that as an aphorism, like a truistic statement about what he thinks about the body versus the soul, then it's a problem. If you just read the whole chapter and say, what is the point he's trying to make? He is not talking about whether the body and soul have a connection to. That's not his point at all. So Paul is tricky because he's a Hebrew who reads the Hebrew Bible, who clearly thinks that if there are a body and soul and they're two different things, they are jammed together so tight that they're almost inextricable from one another. But he uses a lot of body, soul, and spirit language. He has the trichotomy at some points, right? But I don't know any theologian who thinks there's spirit, body, and soul. Right? Paul is the dirty pedagogue, right? He's a teacher for life who I have argued in 2 books that I have argued alongside my Pauline scholar friends who just say, like, look, Paul is always willing to use whatever language and concepts in order to say, like, look, I don't think this is how it actually is, but let me put this in terms that you will understand. And, if you're in Corinth, let me talk to you about people who are in Corinth who are dealing with very different issues than people in Colossae or Philippi or somewhere else. And that's actually that's a technical conclusion that linguistic scholars have come to, because they were trying to find a center, the fool's errand. Like, what is Paul? Paul must be an American guy. He must have like just one thing he's trying to sell to everybody, and everything else hangs on that one thing. Well, to this day, there's been a failure to find the one thing that Paul hangs everything on, outside of Jesus, of course, in his resurrection. But even that doesn't seem to be the singular thing that he thinks is important. So I think Paul is still working in that in a veiled way of communication, even there. But I don't think he's trying to establish or even justify the view that the body and soul, to be in heaven is somehow better. Although I think Paul is the hard case. If I were to make a book-length argument, I would Paul would be the guy I'd have to really deal with. Okay. One more question, and then yeah, go ahead. Or comment.
To take questions now, or did you want to?
Oh, well, only because this was the easy part and we're getting ready to hit the more controversial one.
Okay. Well,
Go ahead.
My thought was, I'll make it really brief. With every single word or term that we're dealing with here, we are dealing with a translation from something that was either originally Hebrew or Greek.
Right.
And then in the derivation of this in intellectual history, they all passed through Latin. And so you have the Latin Vulgate, which the Protestants said, leapfrog over the Vulgate.
Right.
We're going back to the Hebrew and the Greek, but you still have the influence of whatever that Latin translation was of that idea. And so you have that going on. The translation is enormously important here when we take a concept like Sheol. And then if
Translation in this sense is
and then if
problematic.
people have studied literature, they're
Yeah.
very aware of the figures that any of these languages use, including pun, metaphor,
Right.
simile, allegory, parable, dream, wish, dream gets in a separate category, paradox, and all of those, an aphorism. They have special literary meanings of how they're used that you don't have to be a PhD to understand them. They're just in the culture,
Yeah.
and people absorb them if they speak that language and culture. And
Yeah.
you've been mentioning that, but all of these are just sort of about the 4th translation after it went through about 3 languages.
Right. Yeah. Even the term heaven, right? There is no word for heaven in the Bible. It's just the word sky, right? And it's in the plural, the Shamayim and Uranu. So even the way we conceptualize, it's funny, we say the skies in plural without a problem, but if you say the heavens, It sounds a little bit weird, but we're used to it with old translation. So part of the task of biblical scholarship is not to get around, but to set aside the translation problems and go back, not even to the Hebrew and Greek. We have to go back to the other ancient Near Eastern languages, including Egyptian and Akkadian and Sumerian and Western Semitic languages
Exactly.
in which Israelite Hebrew swam.
Then they're all borrowing
Yeah.
from the cultures around them, even though they're trying to create something different.
Yeah.
They're borrowing the concepts from what is parallel in another culture.
Yeah, they're doing the same thing Paul is doing, right? Whereas, I mean, I always point out to like on this point, I always have to stop with students and say, hey, what is, did I mention the word prayer? Did we talk about prayer? So I say, what does prayer mean? Because the biblical authors don't use religious language because they don't have religious language available to them. Because there's no such thing as religious language in Hebrew. By the time you get to the Jewish, Hellenistic Judaism and Jewish Greek Roman citizens, yeah, you have some religious language. But even Paul, right? He said, hey, I have this thing, grace. Well, grace is not a religious term. It's literally the term for gifting somebody. I mean, if you say, actually, it'd be more appropriate, you couldn't get away with modern translations. It'd be more appropriate to translate most of the instances of the word charis as gifted. But again, in American English, saying something is gifted sounds different to us than it would in the Chinese equivalent of something being gifted, or because it has all this cultural packaging. So even with grace, Paul had to figure out, he's like, okay, what is the best metaphor to try and translate for this particular community in this city? Because it won't be the same metaphor he uses in all the cities to all the communities. What's the best metaphor to try and describe grace and this thing, this justification, dikaiosune, which means justice, right? To do the right thing, righteousness. But he means it in this Hebrew way, dikaiosune, for a Hebrew mind like him, a Pharisee, is going to be mainly protect the vulnerable. Right? That's what dikaiosune means in his world. But it also has this meaning in the judicial courts, right? That you can be justified if you have a witness who witnesses on behalf. So he's grabbing all these different metaphors from all over the place. Now, the Protestant Reformation and the Roman Catholic Church, and then debates between them, created this superstructure of what sounded like religious theological arguments about justification by faith alone, right? When, to your point, the actual discussion are these deeply embedded metaphors that any Greek-speaking Jew would have kind of gone, oh, okay, that's a weird way to talk about it, but I kind of get what you're saying there, right? Okay, so that is embedded in the whole conversation. So when I say Sheol, I'm meaning in an ancient Near Eastern Iron Age, before Greek was a spoken language for most people in the world, how did they think of this concept? Right? What are the kind of mentions you get to it in Israel? What are the kind of mentions you get to it outside of Israel by other Semitic language speaking peoples and beyond? Okay. So again, going back, now I'm going to take a slight detour and then we're going to come back to this. I want to talk about radical reorientation. I talked about it last time, but all I mean here is that in the new heavens and the new earth, that if we go back to the human cell and the dirt itself, there's no longer any possibility. There's something about the nature of the universe that it's no longer possible for your human cells in the renewed heavens, new earth to go cancerous. Or maybe at every instance where they can. And again, I'm saying this is where their conceptuality seems to go. This is a theological move to say, I'm compiling all the ways they talk about it and all the instances, and they seem to think it is no longer a no-go. It is a no-go in the new heavens, new earth. There's something about that renewal that keeps dirt from becoming infertile. It will be forever fertile. I mean, look at Genesis 22. What's the image that they're so jazzed about? A tree planted right next to a stream of living water. And living water, again, is not religious language. Living water literally means flowing water, right? Rivers are living water, ponds are dead water, or still water, as we say. That's what the word living water. But again, we can't hear the phrase living water without thinking of at least 3 area churches, right? Because they're all named living water or living waters. And then we think, I'll give this living water to you, give this water to, and she really means spring or spring-fed creek water is what she's thinking in her mind, right? Which would be a gift from God for her to have spring-fed. She's at a well. She would kill somebody, maybe her own child, to have spring-fed creek water flowing into her village so she didn't have to go out to this well. Okay, so there is something in the new heavens, new earth we're still talking about. The goal, right? The goal is the new heavens, new earth, the renewed heavens, new earth. Okay. this is my own controversial claim, is that if it is true that the biblical authors, and this is not controversial, the biblical authors seem to conceptualize a world in which nature, which has been denatured, is going to get renatured by God. It's going to be put back to and oriented to the way it's supposed to go, which means the arrows always go towards beneficence. I'm going to avoid the word flourishing, but it's sufficient. Everything is coherent, no chaos in the negative sense of it. Not randomness, but chaos in the sense that things can deteriorate on us. No entropy, that would be the technical word we're looking for. Now here's my controversial claim. If that is in any way true, we should see physical indications of that world today, right? Otherwise, we're just dealing with fantasy literature, So if they said, oh, no, heaven's going to fix all that and it's going to be magical, God's going to wave a wand, I'm like, oh, okay, well, I can believe lots of things that say that. But if you're telling me that this desk right here, whatever is broken or accursed in it, or, it's going to break down, it's going to pollute the earth somehow with the glues and the laminates or whatever it is about this that makes this desk problematic today, in the renewal of the heavens and the earth, it will be reoriented so it's no longer problematic. It's beneficent. It's coherent. Then we should see physical clues of that. There should be some rational path where you could say like, okay, and here's how that now. By some, I just mean like some kind of indication. Here's one. I think I probably dropped my little line that people supposedly lived 900 years back in the days of the man and the woman, right? And I say supposedly because I'm not even sure if they were actually trying to tell you that they lived that long or whether they were trying to make some other point with those ages. I just want to make this point because I asked some biologist friends of mine and a geneticist friend of mine or colleague at Harvard. I was talking about this at a conference and I said, hey, yeah, that is like genetically, what's the problem with someone living 900 years? I'm just interested, right? And she said, there's nothing genetically problematic about somebody living 900. She says, there's nothing biologically problematic about somebody living 900 years. That's not even a problem for biologists. In fact, it's so much not a problem that there are Chinese labs working on it right now to make it happen, like as we speak. And I did not know any of this, right? She said, it's just as problematic to explain why somebody lives to be my age, 51 years old, as it is to explain why somebody lives to be 900 years old. Because once you cross 25 years old, you hit this new level. I think we're all familiar with the new level of biology where your body just slowly deteriorates after you're 25. I'm trying to warn my kids about all of this right now. Like it's not going to all work that way forever, right? And she started telling me about telomeres. Now, this is Dru Johnson's caricatured, simplified version of the story. So you'd have to go look up the more complex version of the story. But I did not know this, that your body cells regenerate, right? Because you stop and think about it. If I ate the same thing that I ate when I was 25 for my whole life, I just ate the same meal, which most people throughout history did eat the same meal their whole lives, right? And I'm 25 years old. Why doesn't my body just stay 25 years old? Same inputs, same outputs, same environment. Why doesn't year after year, you can understand, why does my skin degrade, get thinner? Why does my brain not quite remember things that it should? And she explained it. Now, this is not a geneticist, like all things are genetic, but she says the genetics aspect of that problem is that your cells have a limited number of reproductions built into them, baked into the system. And they're right here in the telomere at the very end of the cell. Or the very end of, the chromosome. It tells your skin cells reproduce, 5 billion times and then stop. Tells your heart, and each set of heart cells, lung cells, they all have different time lengths on them, right? So they're not the same. As far as they know, they have different time lengths. So your body has built into it right now your death. If you don't get hit by a truck, if you don't have a stroke, like your body, your telomeres already know. Now they're working on how to measure, and you can imagine one trick would be, well, let's just turn that thing off, right? Let's just tell the telomeres to quit talking, shut them up, and they'll just keep reproducing, and then we could be 25 for the rest of our life. Now you can start writing science fiction movie scripts, right? Well, like why this might be a problem. So it can't, so when we talk about abundant life that Jesus talked about, you'll have life and life abundantly in the new heavens, new earth. There's no longer death. There's no longer pain. You can think about all kinds of interesting, well, if you fall off a set of stairs, do you still break your leg? Does it heal at the same rate? Okay, you can You can think, you can thought police this out as much as you want. But the basic premise that it is illogical or irrational or unbiological that you could live 900 years or 1,000 years or 10,000 years is actually not a biological problem at all. So I would point to this as one indication that when the Bible talks about, or when the biblical authors talk about living, they don't have a eternally or foreverness. They don't really have, we map on mathematic ideas like infinity to what they're talking about, but they don't have a mathematic concept of infinity, any of the 4 types of infinity. But when it talks about that long life in the land that goes beyond, well beyond any natural lifespan that we've known and the same one that they've known. I mean, notice in Genesis, an Iron Age text, it limits human life at 120 years. To this day, I don't know if there's anybody who's lived past 120 years. Now that we track people's lives, their age very closely, people still don't live any longer than that. So things have not changed at all, at least in 4,000 years. Okay, so this would be an indication. I have another indication I write about in that Darwin book with psychedelics. As somebody who did some LSD back in the 80s, before I became a Christian, but again, and the publisher said, we need to put a line in here that this is in no way an endorsement of using psychedelics, right? Which I do not endorse using psychedelics because they're all fun until they go really wrong on you, if you know what I mean. But that's another one. I thought that psychedelics, having used them, I thought they kind of wash into your brain and start creating, I mean, I don't know what I thought, right? But what I didn't know is that you already have a psychedelic receptor in your brain. It's H5T40 or something like that. That all LSD does, and I think most of them work very similarly, is they go in and they turn something on that's already there. And you're like, oh, great. Now we know how to get, someone's going to the Chinese are going to figure out how to get us all dosed. No, the upshot of that is the long-term effects of psychedelics is actually that you feel, and long-term, like they study people who, like me, took psychedelics 30 plus years ago. You have a closer sense of connection to creation, to nature, right? To the earth. You have a closer sense of connection to other human beings. And the third one, I think, is pretty fantastic. You have a higher resistance to unauthorized authoritarianism, right? So someone trying to tell you to do that has no right what to tell you to do. So now you understand the whole hippie movement right there, right? So it's, yeah, go ahead.
Was Timothy Leary speaking metaphorically or was he speaking literally?
Which part?
Tune in.
Oh yeah, and
turn on,
drop out,
and drop out. You just said that hallucinogenics really turn something on.
Yeah. They do. I mean, anybody who's done them realizes you feel it does not.
I haven't, by the way.
Oh, sorry. It does not feel enough. And again, the only point I was trying to make is if you're trying to think of a new heavens, new earth reality, like what would that actually be like? Well, if humans were reoriented, the physical part is the same, but it's now reoriented. And you have people who have a very deep sense of connection to nature, to the creation, have a very deep sense of connection to other humans, and they don't want an autocrat. An unauthorized autocrat, you can at least begin letting your mind roll down a trail where you could kind of imagine, like, I guess that could be a better place, like where people could get along better. I'm not trying to in any way sell the idea that like all is going to happen is we're just all going to take LSD. Like this is not headed towards Jonestown, if that's what you're worried about. But again, all I'm trying to do is to challenge us to think, hey, if this is really their conceptuality, that the physical world is good and that it's disoriented and it's going to be reoriented, then the claim has to be backed up by some evidence that there has to be some real indications that could be the case. I give those two just as like baseline, hey, that could be the case. I don't think it's a slam dunk. And I usually put that out to my scientist friends and say, and then they usually go, oh yeah, there's this other thing like that, right? And they start riffing and saying, oh, okay, yeah, there's this other thing that we see that's like this. Okay. Now I want to talk about sex in the new heavens, new earth. And this is a perfect example of Jesus said it, but he clearly didn't mean it, right? But this is where we also have to pay attention to the aphorism, the use of literary device, the use of metaphor here. So when I say Jesus said something, but he didn't mean it, I don't mean that in a facetious way. I'm not trying to take away from the words of Jesus. I mean, he meant it exactly to do what he wanted it to do. His words were always precise, always economical. unlike mine. He could say it very quickly, shortly, and on point. But if you thought he was just talking about, again, in this case, if you thought he was talking about just having sex with a woman, you're really missing the point that he's trying to make. Okay, so I'll read this. This is the famous interaction between him and the Sadducees. If you don't remember, well, actually Luke tells us, in case you're like, Pharisees, Sadducees, what's the difference between those? You can kind of set them off. Sadducees do not believe in the resurrection. They believe when you die, you're dead for real, forever. And that's it, right? But that's important because they're going to come ask Jesus about the resurrection. So now just dig the setup. If somebody who doesn't believe in this, not just like they're not unsure, but like in principle as a group, they said, we do not believe in this thing, right? And they come ask you a question about that thing that you do believe in and you're espousing, like, hey, something big is going to happen in the resurrection, and I'm here to tell you more about it. What would we call the motivation there? What's that? Entrapment. Yeah. Entrapment. It's disingenuous, right? Like, so as soon as a Sadducee approaches Jesus and starts asking about the resurrection, anybody who is alive in this period would have said, well, let's see, this will be interesting. Let's see what Jesus does with this, right? And so Jesus reverse entraps them, I guess. He changes the conversation, but I'll read part of it here. There came to him some Sadducees, those who deny there is a resurrection. Luke himself just wants to make sure that you in case you didn't know, right? Those who deny the resurrection. And they ask him a question saying, Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies having a wife, but no children, the man must take the widow and raise up offspring for her brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first took a wife and died without children, and the second and the third took her, and likewise all 7 left no children, and all died. Afterward, the woman also died in the resurrection, which we do not believe in. That was my commentary. Therefore, whose wife will the woman be? For the 7 had her as a wife. Now, I will admit, that is a darn good question, right? I think that's a question we could all agree, like, man, I wish Jesus would have actually answered the question, because I'm really curious about that. I will also say that they did not pull this example out of nowhere. This is from the Apocrypha, what we now call the Apocrypha. This is from the Hellenistic Jewish text of, it's not Judith, I think it's Tobit where this shows up. So this is an actual storyline in this Hellenistic Jewish text where a woman, and it creates a problem, right? It creates a problem because she has no progeny. Right? There's no generations to follow her, right? So that in the original context, that's the problem. And here's what Jesus says. And Jesus said to them, the sons of this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy to attain to that age and to the resurrection, okay, now we're talking about the resurrection, the age of the resurrection from the dead, neither marry nor are given in marriage, for they cannot die anymore because they are equal to angels, the sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. But that the dead are raised, even Moses showed in the passage about the bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Now he is not God, the God of the dead, but the God of the living, for all live in him. Are you following this argument? Because I am not. I mean, it's like, you're like, wait, where are you going with this? I just want to point out, I think even for the Sadducees, they would also be confused by this, right? So don't feel bad if you are. Then some of the scribes answered, Teacher, you have spoken well. Like, what else are you going to say? For they no longer dared to ask him any question. Okay, I want to focus in on this phrase, marrying and giving in marriage. Because do we talk like that today? Like, hey, what do you want to be when you're older? I hope I'm somebody who marries and gives in marriage. Like, this is a weird phrase. I just want to point out to you that in ancient Greek and Hebrew, this is also a weird phrase. People do not talk like this in the Hellenistic Jewish world. So if it sounds weird to your ears, even in the English translation, you're right. And that's where you start inspecting. So I started looking at this passage. And the first thing I do is I just go in my databases and look up, like, where does this phrase, marrying or giving in marriage, where does this show up? Okay, so here's where you're going to have to just trust me a little bit. There is only one place in the entire New Testament where that exact phrase shows up. All right, so when you see that, you're like, okay, what are you doing? Lo and behold, it also happens in Luke. Now, there are parallels in Matthew as well, because Matthew and Matthew, Mark, and Luke have parallels. There are parallels in Mark as well, but they all show up in the same place. They show up in the parallel story. What's interesting is the parallel. We say, okay, well, let's go over and look at the parallel. Anybody want to guess what Jesus was talking about in the one other place where he talks using the weird phrase, marrying and giving in marriage? Anybody want to guess what the topic was? The same topic, the resurrection of the dead. Okay. So this seems to be a phrase that he uses when he talks about the resurrection of the dead. And I'm telling you, the phrase marrying and giving in marriage has nothing to do with marrying or giving in marriage. Okay, so if you have a Bible or make a note to look to, trust but verify, as our beloved teacher once said, George Bush. Okay, in chapter 17 of Luke, the parallel, he warns his disciples, don't listen to rumors of war. People are going to say, you can just ignore them, right? And then verse 26 of chapter 17, he starts making this comparison. This is the Left Behind passage, by the way, and you can see how people read it backwards. Just as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be in the days of the Son of Man. Okay, first of all, you know about the days of Noah. What does he mean by that phrase? The days of Noah. He's also going to say the days of Lot. So maybe we could say, what's comparable between the days of Noah and the days of Lot? You guys know your Bible, so. What's that? Oh, I don't know what dissolute means, sorry. Okay, learn a new word here. Okay, yeah, profligate living, yeah. What kind? Do you have some graphic imagery you could give me to help me imagine like how profligate it was? The days of Lot? Yeah. Okay. So incestual relationships, public rape of foreigners because they're weak and vulnerable and came into a city and a city state in that day. Yeah. So we don't know much, to quote Aaron Neville, but we know that that the days of Lot are pretty bad because it just has violent rape included in it, or the potential for violently. Entire town rape, right? So it's not just one bad dude in the village, but the whole town gathers. If you look at the description, Genesis 19, it's every man to the last man, the whole village, all of them together gather at the door. So it's a bad scene. In the days of Noah, we just know that the wickedness and violence had spread so bad that it ruins the land, right? To the point where God is willing to, like Sodom and Gomorrah, destroy the whole thing, right? So what would you expect to be the thing? Because Jesus is now going to go on to say, as it was in the days of Noah, as it was in the days of Lot, when they were X, Y, and Z-ing, what do you think the X, Y, and Z is going to be? What would you expect it to be? This is one of those ways when you've read your Bible too much, you become inoculated to the crazy things that Jesus is saying. And you kind of have to go back and pretend like you've never heard any of this before to realize how crazy is it. Well, you could populate your brain with some raping, pillaging, exploiting children, the worst of the worst, right? Whatever QAnon says is going on in the government, that's, something like that. So, okay. So here we go. Here's what Jesus says is the horrible things that were going on in the days of Noah and the days of Sodom. They were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. Likewise, just as it was in the days of Lot, hang on, they were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But on the day when Lot went out of Sodom, fire and sulfur rained from heaven and destroyed them all. So will it be on the day when the Son of Man is revealed. On that day, let the one who is on the housetop with his goods in the house not come down to take them away. And likewise, let the one who is in the field not turn back. Remember Lot's wife. Whoever seeks to preserve his life will lose it. Whoever loses it will keep it. I tell you, in that night, there will be two in bed. One will be taken, the other one left behind. There will be two women grinding together. One will be taken, the other left behind. And if you were unclear where they were taken, the disciples asked, right? To where? O Lord. And he said, where the corpse is, that's where the vultures gather. So you want to be left behind, not taken, because wherever you're taken, that's where the corpse is and the vultures gather. Okay, so someone want to explain to me, remember when I said Jesus says things, but he doesn't always seem to mean them in the flat way that you might understand them? So what were the crimes in the days of Noah and Sodom and Gomorrah? Eating, drinking, buying, selling, planting, building, marrying, and giving in marriage. The only other place in the Bible where this phrase shows up. And remember, a guy named Luke wrote this whole story, right? So 3 chapters later, the Sadducees are going to come who don't believe in the resurrection, and they're going to say, well, which one is she married to? And he says, there's not going to be any marrying or giving in resurrection. It's only for those who are worthy of the age of resurrection. Someone want to disentangle what he might mean there?
Social order will be different.
Okay. What part of social order?
Well, pretty extensive, it sounds like. You can say the world is turned upside down.
Okay. The world upside down. Yeah, that's a phrase that actually is used in New Testament scholarship. Maybe we could ask this. What do eating, drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, planting, building, buying and selling, what do those all have to do with each other? And what do they have to like? And then we have to say, well, what do they have to do with the days of Noah and the days of Sodom?
I think of those things as the context of activities of daily living, but I think also in the context of authority source. When you go back to authority source, it's either me or you, God, and it ain't going to be you. It's going to be me.
Okay.
So I want to do what I jolly well please.
Okay.
And I think that in that construct, when I do what I jolly well please, and I'm going to be a God myself someday and live forever, take off, which is the original sin of the devil. I think that people are oblivious to that lost relationship and go, same thing has always been.
Yeah.
The authority source for me clarifies somehow.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's kind of status quo living. I don't need to pay attention to what's going on because I'm the head honcho. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, can we all admit this is bizarre rhetoric? And can we also admit that he's clearly not talking about eating, drinking, buying, selling, planting, building, marrying, and giving in marriage? He is not referring to any of those. And I can say that really confidently. I have another slide. Boy, how I worked on this chart, but it's so messy. Is because all of those things that were mentioned are exactly what Jeremiah told the refugees in exile to do. He literally says, take sons and daughters for your husbands and wives, right? Give them away, plant, build, be fruitful and multiply. Pray for the peace of the city in which you dwell, for in its peace you find your peace, right? This is literally the advice from a prophet of people in exile. And now Jesus is taking those same things and saying those scoundrels in the days of Noah, those horrible people, the wicked in Sodom and Gomorrah, they're eating and it's hard to even keep a straight face, right? So the same guy, Luke, who seemed good to him to write an orderly account, even though there was Matthew and Mark probably already existed, at least Mark existed at that point. We've already got him making this, Jesus is making the same argument in Luke, I think we talked about it last time, in Luke 12, to farmers in the field, saying, you know how to interpret the clouds in the skies that they mean rain. You know that how to interpret the invisible winds, that it's going to mean heat. Why, you hypocrites, why can you not interpret this present time? And I think that's what you're getting at there as well, is that same kind of argument. Status quo is fine for you as long as me and mine get taken care of, fine, fine, fine. And then you put your head down and you don't pay attention this time. He uses the same argument for the days of Noah and the days of Lot. What was their crime? Well, everybody knew what their crime was. These are Jews who know exactly what their crimes were. But here he says it was putting their head down and doing whatever they wanted. Right? Status quo. Keep on trucking. That's the problem. What's the solution? Annihilation. Again, I told you, Jesus does not stop talking about this big violent act that he's planning for people. So when we turn the page or work down the scroll a little bit in the scroll of Luke, which we don't have the original, but we have some 2nd century copies and 3rd century copies. And we have Jesus confronted by Sadducees who do not believe in the resurrection, roll up on him and give him a little logic puzzle. And he says, yeah, you're not worthy to attain the age of the resurrection because they neither marry and give in marriage. I find it very difficult to believe that in one retort to people who do not even believe anything Jesus says in the first place, that he overthrows the creational institution of marriage. That would be equivalent to him saying, like, yeah, we don't really do Sabbath anymore. We kind of don't need that. Or we don't need to work anymore, right? Those are the three things in creation: work, Sabbath, and marriage that are established before anything went wrong, right? Those are good, fundamentally good things. So what does that mean? Well, so what does he say about having sex in the new heavens and earth? I'd say he doesn't say anything about it. It's basically a no comment. Actually, the problem is my wife pointed out to me. Now, I wrote like a substantial part of a chapter on this in a book. And then my wife a few weeks ago pointed out something to me I had never noticed in this passage that I'm like kicking myself. I'm like, how could I read that so many times in the Greek and never notice this one simple thing? Because people say, I mean, I know theologians that will say, like, yeah, there's no more husbands and wives. In fact, I dedicated that book to my wife, but I dedicated it to my first wife in the resurrection, because you never know. Maybe I'll have 6 more. But the question was, will she be my wife in the resurrection? We've made a resurrection pact that we're just going to stay single if one of us dies early, you know. Well, who knows if we'll keep it? I mean, it's a loose pact, right? But the question is, the real question is, do family relations maintain in the new heavens and new earth, or is it all obliterated? Now, there's lots of reasons to say, of course they maintain, because in all of those passages of the resurrection and all of those passages in Revelation about the new heavens and new earth, they talk about tribes, languages, clans, different people with different relationships to each other. And the groovy thing is although they're very diverse, they're all unified around God. That's like the beauty of it, is that diversity, unity and diversity is finally a possibility that it can never be successful before. But even in this passage, as my wife pointed out to me, she goes, doesn't he go on to make an argument about who God is in light of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And he says they're not dead, but they're somehow living, whatever that means. Like, aren't they father, son, and grandfather? It's like he's making an argument from people who are very distinctly related to each other, as if they are still in that relationship to each other. And like, okay, I may be wrong about this argument. Maybe somebody's going to come along and point out something that's obviously a flaw in this thinking. I'm just only thinking about the way that the biblical author seems to conceptualize the world and the kinds of arguments they use. And as she said earlier, the ways they use metaphor and analogy and aphorism, it does require you to pay attention, right? And if you do that thing where we all have to do it at some point, right? Where you just say, well, yeah, there's no more marriages in heaven. You say, well, why do you say that? Well, Jesus said there's neither marriage nor giving in marriage. I'm like, yes, but what did he mean? What was he getting at? What was he trying to say? Why did he use that phrase? Why did he talk about it that way? Same thing with, I knew it. Well, I won't say what college he's at, not Hope. But a professional theologian who, where we're talking about omnipresence, that God is everywhere. And I had worked a little bit on omnipresence in the biblical view. And I just said it's kind of an incoherent view. Not that God can't be omnipresent, but nobody in the Bible talks about God as if he's everywhere. They talk about him as if he could be anywhere. But usually when they talk about God, they talk about he's up there in the heavens, or he's over there in the tabernacle, right? Nobody makes the claim that he's in the carpet and the urine in our bladders and in cigarette butts or anything like that, right? And it's kind of a medieval theology problem that you want God to be omnipresent. But I asked this guy, he'd done his PhD on God's omnipresence. And I said, well, what's your go-to biblical passage for arguing that God is omnipresent? And no lie, he said, oh, the Psalm, where David says, where can I flee from your presence, right? Wherever I go, you are there. And this is a philosopher and a theologian. And I had to look this guy dead in the eyes. And I didn't say this, but I was thinking, did you turn off your brain when you open up scripture? That does not mean God is everywhere. That means God is going to be present with David wherever it's words of comfort to David. I can say the same words to my wife, right? Wherever you go, it's what a stalker says to people, right? Wherever you go, I will be there. It could be terrifying or comforting, depending on the relationship with you and the person. But it no way logically entails that I'm claiming to be everywhere, right? It means I have the capability and I want to be with you. So a lot of moves like that get made in our thinking. And all I'm trying to sell us on, and I'm just using kind of natural selection and Darwinist thought to get us into, hey, the biblical authors actually have pretty sophisticated thoughts on these things. And you don't have to, like she said, you don't have to have a PhD to figure it out. You can actually follow along with them, go along the grain of their thinking, put big question marks in the borders of your Bible where you're like, I really don't understand what they're talking about here, or why they keep on talking about this thing that doesn't matter to me personally. And that we kind of submit our question, like, okay, we say God is omnipresent. Is he? Right. So a theological answer would be, and I know the Dutch Reformed people love the theology, but I love the biblical authors' theology better than any theology I can come up with, is to say, well, wait, do the biblical authors believe that? And if they do, how would they portray it? Right. They might portray God's omnipresence very differently than the way we would think of it, but they might have a way. They might think of his justice very differently than the way we think about justice. You know, I told you I have this book on biblical law. One of the big hurdles I had to overcome is people think biblical justice means punishment. When biblical justice is not that interested in punishment at all. It's like a third, fourth, fifth tier matter for them. They're very interested in protection of the vulnerable. They're very interested in the flourishing of the community. They're not so interested in punishment. It just becomes a necessary side product in some very extreme cases. So that's all, success for me would be that we are starting to, or continuing, because I'm sure you all do this already, is we're continuing to say, okay, how would the biblical authors conceptualize this problem? I'll give you one more example before we leave. Because I'm a Hebrew Bible person, students constantly bring Hebrew tattoos, like they want to get something Hebrew on them, but they don't know what it says. And I try to talk to them. Now, look, I've got like 8 tattoos all under the shirt here. I got all of them before I turned 17 years old, before I joined the military, right? Because I was a skinhead and I thought it was cool to get tattoos back in the 80s before they were a fad, right? So I know, and I have lots of best friends from high school that are tattooists. So I have skin in the game, literally and otherwise. And I try to talk them out of the idea, like, it's probably not wise to get something permanently put on your body that you don't actually know what it says. Secondly, I will tell you that it says something, but I will absolutely lie to you about it. So yeah, it says exactly what you, it says God loves us. Yeah, go put that on your body, just to completely dissuade them, right? But then they'll say, well, does it say anywhere in the Bible that we can't get tattoos? And I'm like, that's the wrong question, right? I could point you to Leviticus 19 where it says you shouldn't get cuts for the dead and marks like tattoos, but they're really talking about something very different than the fad of tattoos that's sweeping the nation today. Really, the question is it wise to get a tattoo? And that, now you got to go back to the beginning. What are bodies for? What's significant about the bodies? Where are the boundaries of the bodies? I don't know if I talked about this before because everything's blurring from jet lag, but maybe you should ask the question, like, does your body matter, and does the boundaries of your body matter? Tattoos are just body modification. I used to go to a Brazilian church for 13 years in Newark, New Jersey. They are totally into body modification. They have 2 kids and a vasectomy. It's like a law in the Brazilian community. Brazilian women fly, they disappear for 6 weeks down to Brazil. They come back with a brand new behind. It's called a Brazilian butt lift. I didn't know what it was until I was in this, right? Because it's way cheaper to do down there than to do here, right? The guys there, this is New Jersey, so they're meatheads and they work out their bodies into all kinds of dysmorphic shapes because they think it looks good. They're not working out to be healthy and maybe as a side benefit, but they're actually, anorexically working out to get certain muscles built because they think it looks cool, right? Is body modification something that the biblical authors would be down with, or would they say, maybe not, right? And then you have to point to really obvious ones, like people do have to, slaves have to body modify. They have to get their ear pierced, basically, if they say they've gotten themselves into trouble, they've gotten themselves enslaved, and now they say, but I love this family that I serve and I want to stay with them. Also, one key person, like, this is always a cheat when Jesus does it, right? Jesus also undergoes some body modification. And I know about it because, like a marathon runner or a vegan, he won't shut up about it, right? He says, I'm going to suffer many things. I'm going to have these marks. And when he shows up, what does he do? He takes his body modification and he shows it to people saying, look, my body has been modified for you. So if you ask me, is body modification a big deal to God? I'm going to say, yeah, it's somewhere in the big deal category. Like, I think he cares about this. Now, does he think it's wise to get a tattoo? You're going to have to think about that longer. You're going to have to do a little bit more work. But notice that started with the question, should Christians get tattoos? It's the wrong question. And you gotta, again, get back in and say, well, how would the biblical authors think about that question? How would they process that question? And there's a line of wisdom that proceeds all the way from front to back that I think all Jesus does is reinforces the wisdom of the Hebrew Bible and recontextualizes it in the New Testament. And that's all we try to do with natural selection, right? Is to say, I actually think they have some wisdom on this issue of natural selection, but they conceive of the universe and God's relation to it very differently. So there's going to be some hard points where they might not be able to agree with everything in evolutionary science. There might be some surprising points where they're like, yeah, actually, we think that's what that's how a broken world, if you say it's competition to the death, I think biblical authors would say, yeah, we would expect that from a broken world that's disoriented and incoherent right now. But we look forward to a world where there's not violent competition for scarce resources. And with that, I will shut up. Thank you very much for your attention. Yeah, I think we're out of time, right? So I ran out the clock, so I didn't have to take questions.
We are, but you're going to hang around for a couple.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.